Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and I am Vice President for External Relations and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Last night, some of us, or for some of us this morning, actually, we heard President Donald Trump's first official State of the Union in his second term. Last year, there was a speech as well, but it was actually a joint address to the Congress, not formally a State of the Union. And this one actually broke the record. It was longer. It clocked nearly 2 hours, this speech, the State of the Union. And as all of us know, the State of the Union is usually a time for a president to showcase not just to Congress, but to the entire country what the administration's accomplishments have been and the priorities for the coming months. And President Trump certainly did so earlier today in Europe. And within a year, the president and his administration have moved really at lightning speed and are now facing a few headwinds, which I think he also tried to acknowledge: the ongoing partial shutdown of the government, last week's SCOTUS decision, and not and also, of course, the polling data that is leaving the Republicans a little bit on the back foot going into the midterms. I'm really excited to have a fabulous panel today who I'll introduce in just a moment to talk a little bit more about the foreign policy, which was really not at the forefront of this speech. There was maybe just less than, around 20 minutes devoted to foreign policy. But I wanted to also just give a quick list of housekeeping items before we get started. One is that the session is being recorded, and a recording will be made available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So your audio will also be controlled by the host, so no need to worry about muting. And please do send in questions. Use the Q&A button panel at the bottom of your screen, and I will take them toward the end of this discussion in about 25 minutes. So with that, let's get started. Let me just go ahead and introduce our fabulous panel. I'd like to start out with Ali Aslan, who is an internationally recognized journalist and moderator with prominent roles at CNN, ABC News, and Deutsche Welle in his record. And he's also had ample experience in steering high-level global discussions, moderating conversations at major international platforms, including the UN, the G20, the EU, and the World Bank. He's also an alum of GMF's Alliance of Civilizations International Fellowship Program. Also joining me in Europe today is Dr. Elena Lazarou. She is the director of ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. She brings more than 2 decades of experience in international affairs with a focus on EU foreign policy, global geopolitics, transatlantic relations, and security and defense. She previously served at the European Parliament as head of the External Policies Unit of the Research Service and as a senior policy analyst leading teams working on foreign policy, defense, security, and transatlantic issues. I should also note that Elena is an alumna of GMF. She was an emerging young leader a few years ago, and we're so happy to have her continue joining us for GMF programming. And finally, last but not least, I'm really also proud that our GMF Senior Vice President for Global Power Shifts, my colleague Daniel Kliman, is heading up this new pillar at GMF on adapting the transatlantic relationship to a shifting global landscape. His background spans the U.S. government, military, the think tank community, and private sector, and he brings a broad strategic perspective to questions of global power dynamics. So with that, I'd like to start with a question for my colleagues in Europe. This question is both for Elena, and let's start with you since we'll go farthest away from DC. And then I'd also like to hear Ali's perspective on Europe's reaction to the speeches. I mean, Europe has really been bookended so far, I would say, with 2 pivotal, crucial speeches. One, the speech that we just heard at the Munich Security Conference with Secretary Rubio, and then last year's Munich Security Conference with Vice President J.D. Vance. How does this speech sort of fit into the anthology of speeches that you've heard thus far, including also President Trump's speech at Davos? How would you characterize this speech? Elena, please, I'd love for you to start.
Thank you very much, Sudha, and thank you for inviting me to be here alongside Dan and Ali, who I haven't seen in a while, but I think we all have had our long-standing relationship with GMF, and it's great to be here with you. So I am indeed the furthest away from DC, I think, not only because I'm in Europe, but I'm also in Athens, Greece, which is geographically even further away, although, enjoying a very positive moment, I think, in transatlantic relations. And that's one thing I want to start with is that, and I've recently moved from Brussels to Athens, and I have to say, it's very hard to give one answer to how Europe is reacting, because what we've seen under this Trump administration, by the way, under the previous one as well, is a lot of bilateral engagement with individual EU member states. So one thing to say is that there's different reactions in different capitals. But if I may come to your question about, the other speeches as well, I think in many ways this timing of this State of the Union address completes a circle of at least 5 things that we've now been looking at from Europe. One is there's the national security strategy. We had the national defense strategy, the Davos speech by President Trump, the Rubio speech in Munich, and now the State of the Union address. And I would say, looking at those 5, because I think these have given us a relatively robust framework through which to understand the actions that the Trump administration has been taking in its foreign policy. I would say this one was the least foreign policy oriented one, and it makes sense. It's the State of the Union address. I mean, anyone looking, throughout the years at the State of the Union addresses will concur, I think, that they generally serve a more domestic audience, not least in a year of midterm elections, and that is what we are in now. So I think we had no surprises on the foreign policy front, and I don't think, to the question that we were discussing before we start, has anything changed, from a European perspective because of this address. I don't think so, because I think we have had a lot of signals of what was to come and what the contours are through the other items that I mentioned. What's interesting is also that, well, there's a trade component that is very interesting to look at coming from Europe. But I think, we had the Supreme Court decision last week, but, President Trump's, sort of address this issue, but in a way that I don't think introduced to something that, changed the calculations on the European side. And there's a lot going on the European side, and we can talk about that with regard to trade, which is a Brussels based competence. And then on the sort of security issues, there was the mention of Iran and Venezuela, but again, in a context that we are very much aware of, of Iran, the U.S. determination for Iran not to acquire nuclear weapons, and to hold that. There's a discussion in Europe in several capitals about what will be the next step of the Trump administration with regard to Iran. But I think, again, we got the same signaling in terms of that we would have gotten in Munich. And then the Venezuela piece, which was another important security piece in the State of the Union address. Again, it was a sort of recapturing of what we already know in terms of the understanding and the analysis from the Trump administration was done. There was, no mention of Greenland, which has been one issue that has been, let's say, a transatlantic security issue that created some tension. So what I would say is that it really, I don't think what was said has changed the calculus on this side, as Munich perhaps did, or Davos on the economic security front, perhaps. Perhaps what was not said is something that we might want to think about.
I mean, that's definitely a good way of putting it, because, as you said, there wasn't a whole lot of time allocated to foreign policy because the speech is really geared for a domestic audience and for the Congress. But things left unsaid. Does that mean, Ali, that there was no shock effect, right, for Europe? Would you agree with that as well with the speech?
Well, first of all, Sudha, thank you so much for having me. Always happy to join the GMF as a fellow. And look, first and foremost, I'm very happy that I did not stay up for the speech. Let's put it this way. I'm based in Berlin. It would have been quite late. I watched it in full this morning. And I think throughout the 1 hour and 47 minutes, I think the very first real reference to foreign policy was not until it was 90 minutes into the speech. I think President Trump spent more time on and with the U.S. hockey team than on foreign policy. And I think that's in many ways very telling and indicative. Look, he did, of course, boast about getting the NATO partners to pay up 5% of the GDP on defense, as opposed to 2% from his predecessors. But I didn't hear a lot of things, a lot of talk about transatlantic relations, really hardly any mention of Europe, no mention of Germany. I say this because I'm based here in Berlin, of course. No mention, as Elena was saying, of Greenland, which perhaps is a good thing. At Davos and prior to Davos, he was very adamant that the US needs Greenland for its national security. And for him not to mention it at all this time, who knows whether it no longer factors very high on his priority list when it comes to foreign policy issues. There was also only one very quick mention of Ukraine. Interestingly enough, we all know that yesterday marked the 4th anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, something he did not acknowledge. And he more or less presented himself as a peacemaker, once again boasting that he ended 8 wars and he wants to make Ukraine his 9th. But I think more or less, and I think we have to be honest here, Sudha, that the speech pretty much illustrated the relevance, or rather irrelevance in that regard, of Europe these days when it comes to its standing in Washington. I mean, you and I were both based in Germany. We know there hasn't been a U.S. ambassador here in Germany since he took office, and I think that's also quite telling. We can argue whether Europe perhaps, and this is of course a provocative question for the debate, whether Europe deserves to be overlooked these days. That's a different issue, and I'm happy to dive into it. But by and large, the primary aspects, foreign policy aspect of his speech was, of course, devoted and designated to Iran, where President Trump very much emphasized that he wants to resolve this issue through diplomacy, but very much hinting that he's not going to shy away from resorting to attacks and violence if need be. So, yeah, I mean, by and large, look, Sudha, at the end of the day, to answer your question, I browsed the newspapers, of course, online this morning, German ones, but also European ones. Very little mention of the speech, actually. And I think it has to do with the fact that there just wasn't anything of substance for the Germans, for the Europeans, for the transatlantic relations, regardless whether it's the State of the Union and the fact that it's a speech mostly dedicated and designed to address a domestic audience. But in times like these, in these geopolitical, really uncertain times, you would have thought and perhaps even wished that more time was allocated to foreign policy. It wasn't, and I think that's also a sign for us here in Europe, and something we need to pay close attention to.
And given that, Ali, and this is also for Elena, please feel free to weigh in as well, because Europe was really given short shrift. It wasn't mentioned at all, except, of course, the fact that NATO states are now paying more, and Trump obviously touted that as a win due to his pressure. This is not going to change the calculus for Europe, right? Europe will have to continue building up its defense capabilities. I think this speech, and just in general, 3 years of the Trump administration, is going to make Europeans continue on this trajectory of spending more and dealing with their own defense capabilities. Would you agree with that, Elena and Ali? Or do you see differences in compared to, Athens compared to Berlin, for example?
Please go ahead, Elena.
Well, first of all, on the defense component of it, I think we have to take a step back, because indeed the Trump administration has brought more, let's say, momentum and pressure. The Hague summit, and the president did indeed mention that in his State of the Union address, where allies agreed to spend 5% of GDP up to in the next 10 years on as scaling up and from the 2%, which some member states, by the way, still haven't reached. But beyond that, the commitment to building the defense union and the defense, building up and ramping up defense industrial production, but also operational capacity, collective procurement, collective production, economies of scale, European supply chains for major platforms, technological innovation in defense. This is all part and parcel of a project that has started now. Well, it's been 10 years almost now, since 2017, when the EU first set up the proposal to set up a European defense fund. So we've seen a step change in EU defense policy. And I would say, indeed, it was the first Trump administration at the time when this happened. And there was a part of that was motivated by, a certain doubt about, the security guarantees offered by the United States under Article 5 of NATO. But I would say that the major change came with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And if we look at what has happened in the landscape of EU defense policy since then, I would say, the stepping up in investment, in productivity, in commitment, in creating structures that facilitated the military support for Ukraine, the provision of military equipment. That has been a very important component of it. So there is one part that is linked to pressure from the United States, and it is the Trump administration, but going back to even as far as Obama or Bush, it has been a long-standing demand by the United States that the Europeans begin to take more of the burden sharing for European security. But there is a war going on the east of the European Union. And that has also been a very important part of that. Just to add to that, so I don't think it changes something. I don't think, should there be a different administration in the future? And even under, if we go back looking at Biden, but also what may happen in the future, I think the commitment to the defense project is now very, very much ingrained in the orientation of the Commission. A couple of things that Ali mentioned, and just maybe think if I may add. So yes, these were dimensions to the European Union. The burden sharing in NATO, yes, that was also, referred to the EU, but I think it was also connected by President Trump in the State of the Union just to a greater narrative about how the United States, the economy, and generally how we're reducing the expenses for others. And then the second sort of secret or sort of invisible reference, I think, was when the trade agreements were mentioned, because there was the Supreme Court decision was mentioned, but then there was also, but others, we've made trade agreements and others are happy with them. So there Europe wasn't mentioned, but one could imagine that was what was alluded to. But on the other side, in Brussels, I think there's a big discussion about the future of the trade agreement that was agreed in principle in the summer. So that's also another reference. But I think the defense project is there to stay for many reasons to do with the threat environment in which the EU is operating, and a relative worry about the multilateral security guarantees under NATO, but also, what is going to happen with the future of multilateral peace.
Thank you, Elena. I want to go back to Ali before I go to my colleague Dan, just because there is a question in the Q&A box that I'm going to address now, because it's related to what I just asked in terms of German military capabilities. And there's a question here asking about the likely effect of big increases in defense spending on German society and attitudes of German neighbors. We mentioned the 4-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's also the 4-year anniversary of the Zeitenwende speech, the landmark speech that Chancellor Scholz delivered in the Bundestag a few days after the invasion. So, Ali, what do you think? How has German society adapted? The government? Will the military be able to attract young people to serve? And will German industry be able to benefit from the increased spending? What do you think, Ali?
Well, look, first of all, as far as whether this speech of Donald Trump changes anything for the Europeans, I think it does not. I moderated a session with former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the Munich Security Conference just last week. And she also was very adamant that any wishful thinking on the part of Europeans that this is a very cyclical phenomenon, if you will, that if when Donald Trump leaves office in 3 years and we have a Democratic president, that things will go back to normal. Even a Democrat like Hillary Clinton does not believe that's going to be the case. I think the relationship between the US and Europe has fundamentally changed, and it has changed irreversibly. So I think just wanted to make that clear, which of course then ties into your question, which means more responsibility lies with us now to take care of our own issues and matters, regardless of whether NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is saying that without the US. You remember when he famously said, if we Europeans think we can defend ourselves with it without the US, we are more or less dreaming, right? So the NATO Secretary General certainly doesn't believe that Europe can defend itself. So nevertheless, that doesn't exclude and prevent us from the responsibility of having to play our part. And I think in times like these, where new alliances are being shifted and fostered. And as far as your question specifically about Germany, look, Sudha, you also live in this country and you have for a very long time. I mean, it took a very long time for the Germans to shed its, very pacifist, very neutral attitude, which, by the way, it existed for very good reasons for 8 decades. But times have changed, and the society, depending on which poll you believe in on any given day, finds it hard to grapple with that still. I mean, just think of the debate we've had here in Germany and still having about mandatory military service, mandatory/voluntary, that's another issue. And you have many young people who are saying, no, I don't want to fight. I don't want to fight for my country, defend my country. And I think that's, defense spending, military spending aside, and obviously it was a huge issue in Munich, and it is at many other conferences that I go to. I think the seriousness of the situation has been realized. It has been recognized. I think defense spending will go up, and it has to go up. But whether the attitude on the part of the public is aligned with the spending, that's a different issue, right? And I think that is the real issue, Sudha, that we will see in the coming weeks, months, and years. That it's one thing for the German Chancellor to say Zeitenwende, to say the times have changed. This is now a big cut, and for the rest of the German public to sort of go along with it, and so yeah, I think the discrepancy.
It's not even been a year, Ali, right? That since they've changed the debt brake to unleash this 500 billion euro in defense spending. So it's true, it's still very fresh. I'd like to go to Dan, just also maybe Dan to take a step back and look at the big picture. We heard mentions in the speech about, tariffs and obviously the intervention that the Trump administration has undertook with places like Venezuela. So, President Trump and the administration has not been shy about reshaping the global order. I mean, in your opinion, how is the international system adapting to President Trump in his more bolder second term after 1 year in office?
Thanks, Sudha, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. Maybe I'll just kind of unpack the international system into a few different pieces just to be kind of discreet. To start out at the level of kind of international institutions, there's been a hollowing out, both kind of the United Nations, WTO, these kind of flagship organizations, and we've seen a migration to kind of small groupings that are often directed at kind of more functional issues. This is very much accelerated under the current administration. I would say if you look at another kind of major part of the international system, U.S. allies and partners, of course, there's a greater push to self-reliance. We've talked already about Europe's increased defense spending. We see this in Asia as well. And often a kind of interweaving of allies and partners globally as they look to each other in a kind of hedging behavior. In some instances, they're not always. You see kind of warring of ties with China. Lastly, China and Russia. I mean, China has been very opportunistic. It's trying to present itself as kind of a more stable and reliable partner, not necessarily credibly, given that it's a security threat to countries on its border, and an economic competitor. And of course, Russia is trying to break its isolation. So you see these kind of moments of flux across the different actors in the system.
Dan, were you surprised that there was no real mention of China, which the Pentagon or those has called the the pacing challenge for the United States. And I think many people that were sitting there in the well of the House of Representatives, both Republicans and Democrats, would call China the major challenge of the United States. So were you surprised that it wasn't mentioned really in depth in the speech?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think depending on if you look at different U.S. documents that have come out under this administration or sort of the speaker, sort of the focus on China shifts. Often, I think the president is very focused on his upcoming meeting with Xi Jinping, the potential for a deal. And so it would have been surprising to see in this speech kind of very harsh rhetoric as kind of the president prepares for that. I think you've seen in other documents much more kind of forward leaning. The national security strategy focused a lot on kind of economic competition with China, technological, as well as maintaining a kind of favorable balance in the Indo-Pacific. So to me, that wasn't a surprise. And again, I think different audience here, U.S. domestic, also different kind of actor in the administration, president versus others around him.
And Dan, you actually have a very unique position at GMF because you have a purse that looks at Europe, but also at Asia. So how do you describe kind of the reactions within the last year among allies in Europe versus allies in the Indo-Pacific?
That's a great question. I think you've seen actually quite distinct approaches. In Europe, I mean, you hear a lot these days about de-risking from the United States, and you see an attempt to kind of reduce dependency and then strengthen relationships with third partners. Those could be in the Indo-Pacific, it could be the Gulf, even Africa, Latin America. And this is both the security, but also the kind of economic and the trade level for Europe. I would say that Asia is very different. You see, I would say, an effort for more United States and more other partners, where from Japan to Australia, you really see this effort to kind of continue relations with the U.S., very much strengthen defense ties. At the same time, many of these countries are looking to kind of third partners as well. So I think some of this is structural. If you sit in the Indo-Pacific, China is there. There is no way to kind of counterbalance China without the United States. I think Europe, obviously, it looks different. The tensions with Europe have been obviously sharper than U.S. relations with allies and partners in Asia. And also Europe in some ways has more potential to be much more self-reliant.
And you mentioned the national security strategy that was released last fall. Did you see hints of that interwoven in the speech in the small window of foreign policy that was written for the speech?
Yeah, it was interesting to see, I would say, areas of convergence and maybe divergence. So for convergence, obviously, the president's speech talked a lot about ending sort of mass migration, illegal immigration to the United States. And there's a direct connection with the NSS, which focused on not only kind of domestic migration for the U.S., but also mass migration globally. So that thread was there. I would say on the Western Hemisphere, there was a fair amount on Venezuela, again, in the context of, in part, trying to kind of push out foreign adversaries. And so kind of that kind of Western Hemisphere tilt that we saw in the NSS was present. There were a few, again, areas I would say of somewhat divergence. The tone of the NSS obviously was very sharp on Europe. In this case, I mean, the president's the very brief remarks that related to Europe and NATO were much more kind of praised for moving toward the 5% target. You didn't see any of this kind of civilizational language, even a statement about, NATO, we're still allies. And in some ways that was reminiscent of maybe what Secretary Rubio stated in Munich as well. So that was different. And then last but not least, on Iran, the NSS was largely backward looking on Iran, very much focused on kind of the U.S. military operation there over the summer. Obviously, the president was very much forward looking last night here in the U.S., essentially offering kind of a deal, but also talking about potential use for force with U.S. Military assets, of course, massed in the region.
Okay, Dan. So I'm going to start trying to go through these questions and group a few of them. So Ali, I'm going to go back to you actually for Berlin, because there's still a lot of questions on the German defense posture, the new German defense posture. And there's one that talks about nuclear weapons and the debate in Germany right now about whether it's important for Germany to get involved in some sort of nuclear sharing agreement, maybe with partners, or developing its own deterrence. What do you think of that? And let me also put in a question that's being asked by one of our listeners here about Northern European perspective on feeling sort of abandoned, right? Like transatlantic relations, countries. I've also been to Denmark a couple of times in the last year, and a model ally of the United States is obviously feeling different stages of emotion because of the Greenland crisis. How do you think Germany also is dealing with the changing nature of the U.S. Presence in the United States, and also its new agenda, and also talk a little bit about the deterrence question? Ali, I'll give those two questions to you, please.
Well, I mean, the Arctic is very much now at the forefront of geopolitical debate, right? I mean, if you would have told somebody a few years ago we'll be discussing Greenland at the Munich Security Conference in a prominent manner, I think most would have dismissed that idea. But here we are, and I think, look, we can belittle the number of soldiers that were sent to Greenland in order for a quick show of force. But nonetheless, I think Europe was quite unified in its response, and in support of Denmark, by the way. So, that feeling that you're speaking of, perhaps of neglect on the part of northern countries, certainly after the Greenland issue, that bridge will certainly be will be covered, because at the end of the day, it is now being discussed. I myself have moderated 2 issues on Greenland alone at the Munich Security Conference, so it is on everyone's mind. So I think that feeling of neglect or being abandoned on the part of some northern country hopefully is no longer there. As far as nuclear deterrence, look, we in Germany, of course, change never comes easy in this country, right? This is a country that is very, very averse to change, and nuclear energy obviously has been disbanded even during the reign of Chancellor Merkel. And we've always, I suppose, as Germans, perceived ourselves under the nuclear umbrella of the French and the UK. So I don't see a very vivid discussion here, unless it has eluded me, quite frankly. I don't see any vivid discussion here in Germany, a domestic one, that Germany should develop or acquire nuclear weapons, to be quite honest. Nor do I expect it, to be quite honest, Sudha. I think that maybe for some policy analysts to sort of throw in the mix and write some nice columns about it.
Exactly.
But amidst all the issues we have, that is actually not an issue that I, as a journalist, have seen gain any traction here in Germany.
I mean, I think, Ali, I would concur. It's definitely more of a sort of a think tank discussion, and some obviously government officials are probably thinking about it. But right now, like you say, I think the German government has a lot of other goals it wants to achieve. And one thing is also, like you said, beefing up military recruitment. But the next question I have here in the chat is, I'm going to direct the question to both Elena and Dan. Their question is about how the European Union navigates the evolving threat environment in the South China Sea regarding U.S. interests in Taiwan, and how can Europe balance U.S. interests with its own, particularly in light of its trade dependencies on China. Elena, why don't I give that to you? Because obviously there are some ramifications with Ukraine, right? I mean, everybody talks about Taiwan could also be next if we allow Ukraine to fall. So, Elena, why don't you take that, and let Dan also please share your thoughts on that.
Oh, thank you. I think I'll let Dan reply with, hone in on the Asia part of this, because this is not my area of expertise. But what I can say in terms of EU foreign policy is that, yes, definitely there has been across time, since 2022, a discussion of what if Taiwan is next. And I think what that has done is it has made the EU double up on its commitment to upholding international law wherever any kind of situation of territorial invasion or threat of sovereignty or a violation of international law is concerned. So that's one piece of that. The second thing I think is important to say, and this goes beyond, the EU has been navigating this triptych of finding its place between in an environment that some characterize as bipolar, again, where China's rise and the United States and the rivalry between the two is redefining a lot of the global geopolitics. And I think a few things we can mention with regard to creating resilience in that sense, resilience both in terms of, defense capacity, but also economic security, we've seen throughout the years. And part of that is, of course, finding a relationship in terms of trade and investment with China that levels the playing field, that avoids coercion, that creates a level playing field for international procurement, for investment, to do trade and investment with China to a degree that is rules-based and does not allow coercive practices. And at the same time, what we've seen is, and foreign investment screening is also a very big part of that. So really to safeguard the European economy from China's potentially coercive investment and trade practices. The second part of it has been to a degree, so that's a big part, which is an economic security dimension to EU foreign policy. And I think we've seen this growing throughout the past years. Second part, of course, is the diversification. And to that point, I wanted to say when Dan was speaking before, with regard to how Asia has reacted to the new model of US foreign policy, I think one thing that we've seen happening is a denser network of bilateral engagement between the European Union and several Asian countries, not China, but India, Singapore, Indonesia is now a country that I think is being explored. Japan, Korea, of course. So I think that network. I mean, we're seeing a renegotiation now of free trade agreements with Australia. There's been one that was signed with New Zealand. I think that whole area of sort of like-minded partners in South Asia and Southeast Asia, I think, is being explored to a degree that was not the case 10 years ago. And that is all the part and parcel of creating resilience towards China's economic coercive practices. At the same time, one thing that has come up a lot in the EU foreign policy and economic security agenda, which is not unlike the United States, is the way in which, especially since COVID, dependency on critical raw materials goes through China, and China's essentially monopoly of a number of those raw minerals, these critical minerals, and both in terms of processing and exporting. And again, there we're seeing a diversification of engagement with Latin America, Africa. Again, I think if one were to frame it as a whole, the whole practice of engagement with China is to diversify away from, thus creating resilience. And of course, depending on where you look at in Europe, there are also there's bilateral engagement in terms of investments, because economic diplomacy remains a capitals-based engagement with Washington and individual capitals. And there you see also some negotiations with regard to investments and where they come from. So I think that's the general idea with regard to China. But we do have to also say that there is still in Brussels ongoing discussion about, is there one single China policy that represents the whole of the European Union? Because since 2019, when there was a sort of discussion about having a China strategy, we haven't seen something that would represent the whole of the EU. So,
okay. And Dan, please, you obviously have traveled to Taiwan. How do you see the U.S. thinking about Taiwan and balancing China in the neighborhood?
Sure. And I might also comment on some of the kind of earlier questions as well. I mean, I think from the U.S. perspective, it's essentially maintaining a military balance that sustains deterrence with China. And that obviously involves U.S. capabilities, ally and partner capabilities, having a kind of force posture in the region that's robust. And you see this in some of the kind of key strategic documents that have come out. I would say for Europe, particularly, because I think we probably have a serious European audience joining us today. I think Ukraine is a really important test case in terms of China's perception of, would Europe, both at the EU level or nation state level, would it intervene even economically, diplomatically in a kind of cross-strait crisis? I mean, if Europe stands strong on Ukraine and whatever kind of the final resolution is prepared to play kind of a robust security role, I think that will very much convey that Europe has kind of geopolitical heft. And so I think Ukraine actually is a bit of a test case for kind of when China thinks about what might Europe do in a kind of Taiwan crisis. I would say to the extent Europe can economically engage with Taiwan at the nation state level, the EU level, there's definitely synergies there. I would say militarily, I mean, we've seen a number of European militaries be active in the kind of South China Sea and the Pacific, sending ships. I think that does send a kind of strong signal in terms of upholding rule of law as well. So obviously, Europe is not the dominant security actor in the Pacific, but it does have certainly an economic and still a kind of security role that it can play.
And now I'm going to just try again to combine two questions and do a lightning round with all of you. So there's one question here about the loss of America's soft power. And, is President Trump just deploying hard power and depending on hard power to keep the US relevant? And if we can link that up with Iran, for example, obviously in the speech, President Trump definitely put Iran on watch. If there was to be kinetic action on the part of the United States, how would Europe react? Who would like to go first? Would you like to go first, Elena, since I haven't started with you since the beginning?
No, it's interesting you ask about soft power, because as I was, listening to the speech, I found that this part in the end about, 250 years of the United States, and then there was a reference to the way in which the US has been attractive to the rest of the world, etc. So in a way, as I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, this is a reference to soft power. But I don't, it was also, a speech filled with references to the historic majesticness of the United States, so it was also part of that. But hard power, I actually, it's interesting you say this, because I had a look at the 2018 State of the Union address by President Trump, where he talked about nuclear again. And that time it was in the context of North Korea's nuclear program. And I think, this idea of, nuclear power and sort of being the major nuclear power that controls that biggest manifestation of hard power and destructive power and weapons of mass destruction in the world was there then, and it is now. And to be able to control the balance of nuclear armament. And it's interesting that this was mentioned. Iran has come to the fore now with the New START treaty expiring, and really we have really no safeguards with nuclear rearmament. So I think that hard power element is very much there in that speech, even though we said, as I conclude, there is not that much on foreign and security policy, but that very specific reference to being able to be the one power in the world, the one actor that controls, the proliferation of nuclear capabilities. I think that speaks very much to a hard power approach to the world. How Europe would react if there were boots on the ground in Iran, I think at the moment it is an open question. But what I can say is that it's evident in the last few weeks that EU policy towards Iran is also becoming more hawkish than it would be in 2016, and we've seen the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. But I leave it at that, because I still have no answer to that.
Ali, what do you think on that note on Iran and reaction from Europe?
Well, let me start with the first question on U.S. soft power, because obviously, as someone who has lived over a decade in the U.S., who has studied there at Georgetown and Columbia, I've gotten to know and really rally around a country that was based on hard power, of course, but exuded a lot of soft power. That is certainly something, when I talk to my friends all over the world, that is something that is missing now. When we talk about the US, the context is hardly ever positive these days. And that is something not to be overlooked, I think, by many people. The MAGA movement may not care about that, but at the end of the day, this is the world. Nobody lives in isolation, and alliances are needed everywhere. And for the United States, that also wants to project soft power in so many ways, I think that's a very regrettable development. And look, I mean, if you talk about Iran, it's very clear something is brewing. Interestingly enough, Sudha, Donald Trump's threats against Iran, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the very few bipartisan applause rounds during yesterday's State of the Union address. So clearly there seems to be an appetite on both sides of the aisle to do this. Now, of course, we heard from the president yesterday that over 30,000 protesters have been killed in Iran. And as far as Europe's role here is concerned, you know that many European societies, including the German one, has a large Persian diaspora, which are divided, of course, as well, but many who are looking for the US to intervene and to attack. And the Crown Prince Pahlavi was in Munich, was at the MSC, a clear sign. He was courted, he was embraced, he was showcased. So a clear sign that Europeans certainly would not protest, if you will, if the US were to attack. So yeah, I mean, it is. Look, at the end of the day, and being mindful that this is probably my last portion, since we are nearing the end here. By and large, I think generally speaking, because you asked what Europe would do, Sudha, I mean, look, it's very clear that this is an era defined increasingly by great power competition and power politics, right? And the question is, where is Europe's role and future in this new world order? You know, I think that is something that Europe, Brussels, all of the capitals will still have to decide, because one thing is clear, not just since the J.D. Vance speech, not since the Rubio speech, not since yesterday's State of the Union address, nostalgia is not a strategy. You know, I think that's become very, very clear. I think the Europe, I'm sorry, has to be very clear and wide-eyed here about its future, about its transatlantic relations. I say this with a heavy heart as a transatlanticist myself. Obviously, a German who has lived for over a decade in the US, but the signs are very clear. The tensions are there, and look, at the end of the day, you know, how we act will also be factored into how other power players such as China will take us serious. I say this as on a day where Chancellor Merz is in China and is trying to kickstart and restart, if you will, relations with China. So we'll see, but a lot of homework for Europe certainly to be done, Sudha.
Thank you, Ali. And Dan, how do you assess the United States and plans for Iran? You know, President Trump mentioned Midnight Hammer, which was a success, but do you see an appetite for taking military action against Iran in order to prevent nuclear proliferation or bomb-making capabilities?
I think it's certainly seen as a bargaining tool, and I mean, you see diplomacy proceeding in parallel with a military buildup. I think the administration's preference very much would be a kind of diplomatic outcome in which Iran sort of forswears any kind of nuclear enrichment capability. I think if that doesn't come quickly, you could imagine sort of very limited targeted strikes to try to sort of force Iran's hand. Potentially, if that didn't work, kind of more systematic strikes aimed at destabilizing the regime. I don't necessarily see like an appetite for boots on the ground at all, but I do think, to get back to the kind of question, there is perception that hard power delivers based on, of course, Venezuela, as well as kind of Midnight Hammer last year. On soft power, I would just note one, I think if you sit in Washington, I think this administration has a different understanding of soft power, and just helpful to understand that, which is very much more on kind of civilizational. And you see that in some of the kind of dialogue now with Europe, as well as kind of American innovation. And so it is different from, I would say, the definition of soft power that is often leveraged.
Okay, so I'm going to ask just one last question and leave you all very brief comments. If it's unfair, feel free to expand on the answer. But I know we're short on time. And there's one question in the chat that you can answer on Ukraine and European deterrence. So the question is, do you think Europe will pick up the slack as the United States gives Europe more and more responsibility? Will Europe be able to play that role in fortifying Ukraine for NATO's deterrence on the eastern flank? That's one question. Or you can talk about soft power. I, have looked, looking at the last few years, we've seen in Europe, obviously, Obama bounce after Bush, a Biden bounce after the first Trump administration. If there is a change in administration in 2028, do you think that there will be a bounce again if a Democrat is elected into office. So, Elena, you go first, please, and then we'll go to Ali, and I'll have Dan round us out. So you have one of two, or just briefly.
Yeah. Well, I think the optimum scenario is one where, you know, Europe steps up its game on defense, which it's doing, and then works together with the United States to support Ukraine. I think we have to bear in mind that, you know, Ukraine's support, you know, it's goes out on several axes. Of course, there's the support and military support, but we're also, you know, looking forward. We're going to face the reconstruction of Ukraine and the cost that means. Security guarantees for Ukraine, which, by the way, is, you know, something that Europe is working on, and we need to qualify this here. It's not just the EU; it's Europe. It's with the United Kingdom and potentially other partners. But in the end, you know, I think in order to and President Zelensky has said this, and I think it's fitting we talk about this today. It's all since the anniversary was yesterday. Both U.S. and European support is needed to get the optimum outcome for Ukraine. And I think by stepping up its act on defense, but also continuing the support, the macro financial support, the military support, and an optimum solution for security guarantees, then I think Europe will get also the United States continued support in working together on Ukraine, because we will not go into this because we're about to finish. But, you know, in terms of military capabilities that are needed to help Ukraine win this war, we need a combination of what the U.S. can provide, but also with an upgraded EU defense capability, which is now, I think, very well in the works of going forward. So I think, yeah.
Ali, why don't you take the question about because you talked about the trust and the, you know, the soft power. Do you see the United States being able to sort of regain trust if there's a change in administration in 2028?
Look, it is possible, of course, and one would hope so. But at the moment, I find myself so often talking to people who are asking themselves and around, can we still go to the United States? I mean, who would have thought in the year 2026? And of course, they're saying, well, you know, they may look at my social media posts, they may hold me there against my will for no apparent reason, and so on and so forth. Just the fact, Sudha, that we are discussing this and that it is a possibility and that we're contemplating it is already damage enough, right? I mean, we have the World Cup coming up in the summer in the United States, and I have a lot of friends with tickets who are, rethinking whether they should go or not because, they don't want to encounter any issues entering or leaving the country. And I think to answer your question, anything is possible, of course. The United States, more than any other country in the world, is capable of reinventing itself. And I think as the United States is celebrating its 250th anniversary on July 4th, I think I still have a great deal of faith in the United States, not only because it has become a big part of my personal biography, but also because I've seen the changes in the country and throughout the country over the decades. And this is a rough road right now. There's no two ways about it. The fact that a European citizen might have to think twice about going and visiting the country. But again, nostalgia is not a strategy, but at the same time, the hope is there, of course. The hope is there. And I think the United States, more than any other country in the world, look, Obama followed after George W. Bush. Don't forget that, right? And George W. Bush followed, we had a president who attacked Iraq, and now we know under completely false premises. And it was followed by President Obama, the first African-American president in the history of the United States. So who knows what comes next in 3 years? I mean, it doesn't have to be necessarily a Democrat, right? I mean, who knows? Marco Rubio, whom President Trump yesterday explicitly singled out and praised him for being very popular and so on and so forth, could be a contender, even though it seems, because Elena talked about Ukraine, it seems that U.S. foreign policy these days is mostly run by two real estate developers, but that's that's another issue.
Different virtual panel.
That's for another discussion. But no, Sudha, by and large, the optimism in the United States is always something that impressed me, that I admired, especially as somebody coming from old Europe, where we try to make things look worse than they actually are. So, and I take that optimism. I want to end with that optimism that was so contagious during my time in the US and say, yes, hopefully we'll see better days.
Thank you, Ali. And Dan, maybe going back to Ukraine, how do you see Ukraine being sort of a test case for the transatlantic relationship? Do you see this like for Europe to show that they can do this on their own, or as Elena mentioned, manage sort of offsets that will also, in the end, maybe help the transatlantic relationship?
I think it very much is sort of at the center of this administration's expectations that Europe step up from a kind of security perspective. And that, I mean, if Europe does, including security guarantees, I think that will certainly address a lot of the kind of expectations that we've seen coming from Washington. I did, Ali, to your note, I'll end on a note of optimism, because I do think it's good to end that way. That I do think when we look, whether it's now or to 2028 and beyond, I mean, there are, I would say, very much kind of bright spots for transatlantic cooperation. And you see this today. I think you'll see it post 2028, whatever kind of electoral outcomes then. Areas such as defense tech, working on global infrastructure, as well as rare earths. And these are, frankly, kind of through lines that we see in multiple U.S. administrations as areas that there's a desire to work with the transatlantic partnership. I do think, looking sort of, again, over the medium to long term, I do think expectations, again, whatever outcomes in 2028, I think there will be expectations of Europe continuing to step up and very much realizing the kind of potential that we've seen with this higher defense spending and kind of increased engagement when it comes to Ukraine. So again, I would say I think we should look at these optimistic bright spots, and they do have very much potential to grow and kind of continue in the years ahead.
Excellent. Always good to end on an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Elena, Ali, and Dan, for spending time with us. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. It's just shy of 5 o'clock. I did not get to all of the questions, but I hope you will be able to tune in for our next virtual discussion and future GMF programming. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're tuning in from. Take care. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.